Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is, why was the life of an empress so boring? You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why was the life of an empress so boring? Throughout history, the title of an empress has always sounded like one of the most powerful positions a person could have. An empress was surrounded by luxury, wealth, servants, palaces, and unimaginable privilege. From the outside, it looked like a dream life. A life where every wish could be fulfilled and every command could be followed. But behind the golden walls of imperial palaces, the reality was often completely different. For many empresses, life was not filled with freedom, excitement, or personal choices. Instead, it was a carefully controlled existence where every movement, every word, and even every emotion could be judged by the court. The strange truth is that becoming an empress often meant gaining power while losing independence. An ordinary person could wake up, walk outside, meet friends, choose their own path, or make simple decisions without anyone watching. But an empress lived under constant observation. Her daily routine was planned by tradition, politics, and royal expectations. Every morning began with rituals. She could not simply wake up whenever she wanted. Her schedule was controlled by palace rules. Servants, advisors, ladies-in-waiting, and officials surrounded her from the moment she opened her eyes. Even getting dressed was not a private activity. For an empress, clothing was not just fashion. Every color, material, and design could represent status, tradition, or political meaning. A simple mistake in appearance could become a topic of discussion throughout the palace. Her meals were also controlled. The food she ate, the way she ate, and who she ate with could all have symbolic importance. A royal meal was often less about enjoyment and more about showing power and stability. This was one of the first reasons why the life of an empress could become extremely boring. Almost everything was a performance. An empress was expected to represent perfection. She was not just a person, she was a symbol of an entire empire. If she was sad, she had to hide it. If she was angry, she had to remain calm. If she was tired, she still had to appear graceful. Her personal feelings often mattered less than her public image. The palace itself, despite being enormous, could feel like a beautiful prison. Imagine living in a massive palace with hundreds of rooms, yet only being allowed to enter certain areas. Imagine having countless servants, yet very few people who could speak to you honestly. Many empresses had everything money could buy, but lacked something simple, normal freedom. Friendship was complicated. Who could an empress trust? A person who acted like a friend might secretly be trying to gain influence. A servant might report her private conversations. A family member might have political motives. The higher her position became, the harder it was to know who truly cared about her. Marriage was another difficult part of imperial life. Many empresses did not marry because of love. Their marriages were often arranged to strengthen alliances, unite powerful families, or secure the future of the empire. A young woman could suddenly be taken from her home and placed into a palace where everything was unfamiliar. She had to learn new customs, new expectations, and a new identity. She was no longer simply herself. She became the empress, and with that title came endless responsibility. One of the biggest duties of an empress was producing an heir. In many empires, the future of the entire dynasty depended on her ability to have children. This created enormous pressure. Her body was treated as a political matter. Pregnancy was not just a personal experience, it was a national event. If she failed to produce an heir, people might blame her. If she gave birth to a daughter instead of a son, she might face disappointment from the court. This pressure made the glamorous image of an empress much darker. The palace also created a strange kind of boredom. There were no modern forms of entertainment, no quick communication, no easy travel, and no private adventures. A normal person might spend a day working, exploring, meeting different people, or experiencing new things. An empress might spend hours attending ceremonies, reading, praying, practicing arts, or waiting for official events. Days could feel almost identical. The palace walls remained the same. The faces around her remained the same. The routine rarely changed. For someone who had everything, life could become surprisingly repetitive. Many people imagine royalty as endless parties and celebrations. But royal celebrations were often exhausting. A banquet was not simply a fun gathering. It required preparation, rules, and careful behavior. An empress could not relax like an ordinary guest. She had to maintain dignity. She had to watch every action. She had to remember that everyone was watching her. Even entertainment had limits. Music, poetry, painting, and literature were common activities among royal women, but they were usually connected to education and tradition rather than pure enjoyment. An empress might have access to the finest artists and performers in the world, yet still feel trapped by her position. The greatest irony was this: the more powerful she became, the less personal freedom she often had. The crown gave her authority, but it also placed invisible chains around her life. People saw the jewels, they saw the throne, they saw the palace, but they did not always see the loneliness behind it. The life of an empress was not simply a life of luxury. It was a life of expectations, a life where every decision could affect an empire, a life where personal happiness often came second to duty. And that is why the life of an empress could be far more boring, controlled, and complicated than people imagine. The greatest misunderstanding about empresses is that people often confuse luxury with freedom. A golden palace can look like paradise from the outside, but for the person living inside it, that same palace can feel like a world with invisible walls. An empress could own the finest clothes, the rarest jewels, and the most beautiful rooms, yet still be unable to make simple choices that ordinary people took for granted. She could not simply walk through a city whenever she wanted. She could not easily meet strangers. She could not speak openly about every thought she had. Every action had meaning. Even silence could become a message. In an imperial court, people watched everything. The way an empress greeted someone could show favor. The way she ignored someone could create rumors. A small facial expression could become political gossip. This constant attention made everyday life mentally exhausting. The palace was full of people, but an empress could still feel completely alone. Hundreds of servants might surround her, yet very few people could truly speak to her as an equal. Everyone had a reason to be careful around her. Some people feared her. Some people wanted something from her. Some people wanted to use her influence. Finding a genuine relationship inside the palace was extremely difficult. For many empresses, loneliness became one of the hidden costs of power. The daily routine inside the palace was also highly repetitive. Morning ceremonies, official meetings, religious activities, lessons, royal dinners, formal appearances. The same traditions repeated again and again. The palace calendar was not designed around personal happiness. It was designed around maintaining the image of the empire. An empress was expected to be disciplined. She needed to represent elegance, intelligence, patience, and morality. But behind this perfect image was a human being who could feel boredom, frustration, and sadness. The problem was that she often could not show it. A normal person could complain about a bad day. An empress often had to hide even the smallest disappointment. If she looked unhappy, people might question the stability of the royal family. If she appeared weak, enemies might use it against her. Her emotions became another thing she had to control. One of the most unusual parts of being an empress was that personal hobbies could also become political. A simple interest in art, music, or literature could influence the culture of an entire empire. If she supported an artist, that person could become famous. If she promoted a certain style, the court might follow. Even her personal taste could have consequences. This meant she rarely had activities that were only for herself. Everything had a public side. The palace also had strict social rules. There were rankings everywhere. Who entered first? Who sat where? Who spoke before whom? Who received attention? These details might seem small, but in royal life, they were extremely important. Breaking a tiny rule could create conflict. An empress had to remember countless traditions. She had to know how to behave with kings, nobles, officials, ambassadors, and family members. A mistake could damage relationships between powerful groups, so even simple conversations required careful thought. Imagine having to think about every sentence before saying it. That was the reality for many empresses. Another reason their lives could feel boring was the lack of adventure. Today, people can travel quickly, communicate instantly, and experience thousands of forms of entertainment. But many historical empresses lived in eras where travel was slow and dangerous. Leaving the palace was often a major event. A short journey required planning, guards, servants, and official approval. Spontaneous trips were almost impossible. The world outside the palace might as well have been another universe. Some empresses spent years inside the same walls. They watched seasons change through palace gardens. They saw generations of servants come and go. They witnessed political dramas, but rarely experienced ordinary life. This created a strange contrast. They were among the most famous people in their empire, yet they could be disconnected from the lives of the people they ruled. Their world became smaller and smaller. The palace offered comfort, but it also created isolation. Even relationships inside the royal family were complicated. An emperor and empress might appear like a perfect couple in public, but their private relationship could be very different. Sometimes there was respect, sometimes there was distance, sometimes there was rivalry. A marriage between two powerful people was not always a personal relationship. It was also a political partnership. The empress had to understand that her husband was not just a husband. He was the ruler, and that changed everything. Even motherhood was different for an empress. A royal child was not only a child. That child represented the future of dynasty. Every illness, every decision, every education choice became important. The empress had to think about the future of the empire. A mother's love existed, but it existed inside a world of politics. This pressure made even family life complicated. The public imagined that empresses lived perfect lives, but behind the palace doors, many struggled with fear, loneliness, and endless responsibility. The crown looked beautiful. The reality was heavy. Because being an empress meant living for a role bigger than yourself. And when a person spends their entire life serving an image, they can slowly lose the freedom to simply be human. The most fascinating thing about the life of an empress is the contradiction that surrounded her existence. She was one of the most powerful people in the empire, yet she often had very little control over her own daily life. A farmer, a merchant, or even a common worker might have faced a difficult life, but they could still make many personal choices. They could decide where to go, who to meet, and how to spend their time. An empress lived differently. Her entire existence was connected to duty. From childhood, many royal women were trained for their future position. They learned manners, traditions, languages, religion, music, literature, and court behavior. These skills were not simply hobbies. They were preparation for a life where every moment would be judged. A future empress was not raised only to be happy. She was raised to represent an empire. This expectation could begin at a very young age. A girl who was chosen to become part of a royal family might leave behind everything familiar. Her home, her friends, her childhood memories, and her previous identity could all disappear. Suddenly she entered a world where every person had a title, every room had rules, and every action had consequences. The palace looked beautiful, but it was a completely different universe. Many empresses discovered that royal life was not about getting whatever they wanted. It was about giving up many things. They gave up privacy. They gave up normal relationships. They gave up the ability to live without being watched. The strangest part was that many people envied them. From outside the palace, people saw luxury. They saw expensive clothing, huge celebrations, and powerful status. They rarely saw the restrictions. They did not see the hours spent following traditions. They did not see the pressure of producing an heir. They did not see the loneliness of sitting in a palace where everyone treated you differently. The image of an empress was carefully created, and that image had to be protected. A major part of royal life was appearance. An empress could not simply dress however she wanted. Her clothing communicated messages. A particular color could show authority. A certain style could show connection to tradition. Jewelry could represent wealth and power. Even hairstyles could become symbols. Her appearance was not just personal, it was political. This meant getting ready could become a long and complicated process. A simple morning routine for an ordinary person might take minutes. For an empress, preparation could involve many people. Servants helped with clothing. Advisors considered what was appropriate. Officials considered what impression she would create. A single public appearance required careful planning. The irony was that an empress could be surrounded by luxury, but have very little spontaneity. Nothing was random. Nothing was casual. Even happiness could feel like a responsibility. Royal ceremonies were another example. To ordinary people, a royal ceremony looked exciting. The music, the decorations, the crowds, and the grand atmosphere created an image of celebration. But for the empress, these events were often work. She had to stand correctly, speak correctly, move correctly, react correctly. A ceremony that lasted a few hours might require days of preparation. And after it ended, there were often more duties waiting. The public saw the beautiful moment. They did not see the exhaustion behind it. Another challenge was competition inside the palace. Imperial courts were not always peaceful. Different groups wanted influence. Royal relatives, advisors, nobles, and officials often competed for power. An empress had to understand these hidden conflicts. A simple friendship could be misunderstood. A conversation could create rumors. A favor could create enemies. She had to be careful about everyone around her. Trust became rare. This constant political environment made palace life stressful. Imagine living in a place where every conversation might have a hidden meaning, where every person might have another reason for approaching you, where every mistake could become a problem. That was the reality many empresses faced. The palace was not only a home, it was a battlefield without weapons. The battles were fought with words, influence, alliances, and reputation. And the empress was often at the center of it all. Despite all these difficulties, some empresses found ways to create meaningful lives. Some supported education, some encouraged art, some influenced laws and culture, some became powerful political figures. But even the most influential empresses had to work within strict limits. Their power existed, but it came with conditions. They could influence the empire, but they could not always control their own world. The title of Empress sounded like freedom. But for many women who carried that title, it was a beautiful responsibility that never ended. The crown was heavy, the palace was quiet, and behind the image of perfection was a person simply trying to survive a life designed for them by others. The deeper we look into the life of an empress, the more we discover that the greatest challenge was not the lack of luxury. It was the lack of ordinary human experiences. An empress could have the largest palace, the finest servants, and the most expensive possessions in the empire. But she often missed the small freedoms that made life enjoyable. She could not simply walk through a crowded market and talk to people. She could not sit in a public place without attracting attention. She could not easily make new friends without questioning their intentions. The world around her was carefully controlled. This created a strange kind of boredom. Not the boredom of having nothing to do, but the boredom of having everything planned. Every day followed a pattern. Every event had a purpose. Every meeting had a reason. There was very little room for surprise. For many people, unexpected moments make life interesting. But for an empress, unexpected moments could be dangerous. A surprise visitor could create political problems. An unexpected decision could upset powerful families. A change in routine could create rumors. So the palace preferred order over excitement. The same structure that protected the royal family also trapped them. One of the biggest misunderstandings about royal women is the idea that they were always surrounded by love. In reality, many empresses experienced complicated relationships. People often treated them according to their title rather than their personality. A servant might be respectful because she was the empress, not because she knew her as a person. A noble might show kindness because he wanted influence. A family member might support her because of political advantage. This made emotional connections difficult. The higher a person rose, the harder it became to know who was sincere. For an empress, loneliness could exist even in a room full of people. Another unusual part of royal life was the pressure to appear perfect. Modern people often understand that leaders are human. They make mistakes, they feel tired, they have bad days. But historical empresses were expected to represent an ideal image. She had to appear calm during crises. She had to remain elegant during personal struggles. She had to show confidence even when she felt uncertain. Her emotions were considered a public matter. If the empire was facing problems, people looked at her behavior. If she seemed worried, others might become worried too. Her expression could influence public opinion. This meant she was always performing a role. The palace could turn even a person's personality into a responsibility. An empress was also expected to be a symbol of morality. Her behavior was judged more strictly than others. A mistake made by an ordinary noble might be forgotten. A similar mistake by an empress could become a historical scandal. She was expected to represent the values of the empire. This created enormous pressure. She was not allowed the same freedom as others. Even private decisions could become public discussions. Her friendships, hobbies, and personal interests could all become topics of debate. The pressure became even stronger when politics entered her life. Many empires depended on alliances. Marriage was often used to create connections between powerful families or nations. An empress might find herself in a position where her personal feelings mattered less than political goals. Her marriage could affect wars, peace agreements, and the future of the dynasty. This was a huge burden to carry. Imagine knowing that your personal life was connected to the fate of millions of people. That was the reality of many royal women. Even motherhood became a matter of politics. The birth of a child could decide the future of the empire. A son could strengthen the dynasty. A daughter might create a future marriage alliance. Every royal birth had consequences. The empress's role as a mother was deeply personal, but it was also political. This could create emotional conflicts. She wanted to protect her children like any mother, but she also had to think about the empire. The child was both family and symbol. This was one of the hardest parts of royal life. The palace also created separation from ordinary society. Many empresses lived in a world where almost everyone around them belonged to the elite. They rarely experienced the struggles of everyday people directly. They heard about problems through advisors and reports. They saw the empire through a controlled window. This distance could be both a privilege and a weakness. They had power, but they were separated from the reality of many people they represented. The most ironic thing about being an empress was this. She was famous everywhere, but her personal world was extremely small. Millions might know her name. Artists might paint her portrait. Historians might write about her. Yet her own daily life could be quiet, repetitive, and lonely. The crown gave her a place in history, but it did not always give her happiness. Behind the throne was a woman who wanted respect, a woman who wanted trust, a woman who sometimes wanted nothing more than a normal day without rules. And that is the hidden reality of an empress's life. A life that looked like a dream from outside, but often felt like a carefully decorated cage from within. The image of an empress has always been connected with greatness. People remember the crowns, the palaces, the royal portraits, and the grand ceremonies. But history often hides the ordinary moments, the quiet mornings, the endless waiting, the repetitive routines, the moments when an empress was simply alone with her thoughts. Because behind every royal title was a person who had to live through thousands of normal hours. And those hours could feel surprisingly empty. The palace was a place where time moved differently. A person outside the royal world might spend a day working, traveling, meeting different people, or discovering something new. But inside the palace, days could blend together. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same formal conversations, the same responsibilities. An empress might spend years surrounded by beauty and still feel that every day looked almost identical. This was one of the hidden reasons royal life could become boring. There was comfort, but there was little change. And humans often need change to feel alive. The palace environment was designed to protect tradition. Tradition was important because it represented stability. But tradition also meant repetition. The same ceremonies happened every year. The same celebrations returned every season. The same rules were followed by every generation. An empress was not only living her own life, she was carrying centuries of expectations. She was connected to the past. She was expected to protect old customs. This made her role feel endless. She was not free to simply create her own identity. Her identity was already connected to the throne. Another difficult part of being an empress was the lack of privacy. Today, a person can close a door and have a private moment. But for many empresses, privacy was extremely limited. Servants were nearby. Officials needed access. Members of the court watched her schedule. Even personal activities could be interrupted by royal duties. She might not even have the simple freedom of spending a quiet afternoon alone. Her life belonged partly to the empire. The palace was full of people, but personal space was rare. This created a strange emotional experience. She was never truly alone, yet she could still feel lonely. The relationship between an empress and the emperor was also complicated. People imagine royal couples as powerful and romantic. Sometimes they were, but often their relationship was shaped by duty. An emperor had responsibilities. An empress had responsibilities. Their marriage was not only about affection, it was about producing heirs, maintaining alliances, and representing the strength of the dynasty. Sometimes they became close. Sometimes they remained distant. Sometimes they were simply partners in a political system. The title of empress did not guarantee love. It guaranteed responsibility, and responsibility could become exhausting. Another reason life could feel boring was because the Empress often had limited choices about her future. Most ordinary people make decisions based on personal dreams, what career they want, where they want to live, who they want to marry, what kind of life they want to build. But many royal women had those decisions made for them. Their future was planned by family, tradition, and politics. They were prepared for a role before they even understood what that role meant. A young woman could become one of the most powerful people in the world, yet still feel like her own life was not fully hers. The palace also created a world where mistakes were remembered. An ordinary person could fail privately. An empress often failed publicly. If she made a wrong choice, historians might record it. If she showed weakness, enemies might use it. If she trusted the wrong person, it could become a political crisis. This made many empresses extremely cautious. They had to think before speaking, think before acting, think before trusting. Such caution might protect them, but it also made life less spontaneous. The fear of consequences could remove excitement from everyday life. Even entertainment was different from what people imagine. A royal performance or celebration was not simply relaxation. It was another official duty. The empress had to be present. She had to behave correctly. She had to represent dignity. A normal person could laugh loudly or leave whenever they wanted. An empress could not always do that. Her enjoyment also had rules. This shows the strange reality of royal privilege. Having access to everything does not always mean being able to enjoy everything. The palace offered unlimited luxury, but limited freedom. It offered influence, but demanded sacrifice. It offered admiration, but often created isolation. The life of an empress was not boring because she had nothing. It was boring because so much of her life was decided by others. The most important question was not, did she have everything? The question was, did she have control over anything? And for many empresses throughout history, the answer was complicated. They had power over others, but they often struggled to control their own lives. The life of an empress was a strange combination of privilege and limitation. She could command attention without asking for it. She could influence decisions without holding a sword. She could live in a palace that others could only dream about. But at the same time, she could be trapped inside a world where every moment belonged to tradition. This was the hidden contradiction of being an empress. The title gave her importance, but it also took away parts of her ordinary humanity. One of the most difficult parts of palace life was the constant pressure to maintain dignity. An empress was rarely allowed to appear ordinary. If she was sick, she had to recover privately. If she was exhausted, she still had to attend important events. If she was unhappy, she often had to hide it. The public wanted to see perfection. They did not want to see a tired person. They wanted to see the symbol of the empire. This meant many empresses lived with a permanent emotional mask. They learned to separate their private feelings from their public image. Over time, this could become exhausting. Because when someone spends years pretending to be perfect, it becomes difficult to know where the role ends and the real person begins. The palace also created a strange relationship with time. For ordinary people, life is often measured by personal experiences. A new job, a new home, a new journey, a new friendship. But for an empress, life was often measured by royal events, the birth of an heir, a political agreement, a ceremony, a visit from another ruler, a crisis. Her personal story was often replaced by the story of the empire. History remembered what she did for the throne. It often ignored what she wanted for herself. This is why many royal women remain mysterious figures. We know their titles, we know their achievements, but we do not always know their private thoughts. The palace protected their image so carefully that their true personalities sometimes disappeared behind the crown. Another hidden difficulty was competition. An imperial court was not just a home, it was a network of power. Different people wanted influence, different families wanted advantages, different groups wanted the attention of the ruler. An empress had to understand these complicated relationships. A person who seemed loyal might have another goal. A person who appeared friendly might be collecting information. A simple conversation could have political consequences. This meant trust was dangerous. The empress had to be careful even with those closest to her. A palace could be full of luxury and still feel like a place where everyone was watching. Another challenge was that royal women often had limited opportunities to experience the outside world. The palace might contain gardens, libraries, art, and beautiful architecture. But it was still only one environment. Many empresses spent much of their lives inside these spaces. The world beyond the gates became distant. They might hear about wars, discoveries, and changes through reports. But they experienced them differently from ordinary people. Their connection to reality was filtered through the court. This could create a feeling of isolation. They ruled over a world they could not always personally see. Perhaps the most painful part of being an empress was that even her success could create distance. The more powerful she became, the more different she became from everyone else. Before becoming royal, she might have had normal relationships. After gaining the title, people treated her differently. Old friends might become formal. Family members might behave carefully. Strangers might see only the crown. The woman behind the title could disappear. This is why some empresses searched for private escapes. Some turned to books. Some focused on art. Some found comfort in religion. Some created personal collections. These small private worlds gave them moments where they could feel like themselves. Because even the most powerful people need something that belongs only to them. A room, a hobby, a conversation, a memory. Something untouched by politics. The irony of royal life was that an empress had access to almost everything except a normal life. She could own rare treasures, but not buy freedom. She could have hundreds of servants, but still lack true companionship. She could live in a palace, but still dream of simple moments. And perhaps that is why the life of an empress was sometimes so boring. Not because she lacked entertainment, not because she lacked luxury, but because she lacked the ability to live without constantly performing a role. The crown was beautiful. The throne was impressive. The palace was magnificent. But behind all of it was a person trying to find meaning in a life that had already been decided. The story of an empress is often told through grand moments. A coronation, a royal wedding, a political victory, a famous portrait, a powerful speech. But history rarely talks about the thousands of ordinary days in between. The days when nothing dramatic happened. The days filled with routine. The days when an empress simply waited. And waiting was a major part of royal life. Inside the palace, many things moved slowly. Important decisions required meetings. Meetings required discussions. Discussions required approval. Even simple matters could take a long time. An empress could not always act quickly. She had to follow the system around her. This created another type of boredom, the feeling that life was moving, but never at her own speed. A person with less power might solve a problem immediately. An empress might need to pass through layers of tradition and authority before anything changed. Her position looked powerful, but the system controlled her. Another strange part of royal existence was the difference between having influence and having freedom. An empress could sometimes influence major decisions. She could support certain ideas. She could encourage cultural changes. She could advise the ruler. But influence was not the same as control. She still had to operate within the boundaries of the court. She could suggest, She could persuade, but she could not always decide. This created a complicated relationship with power. She was powerful enough to be watched by everyone, but not always powerful enough to do exactly what she wanted. The public also created unrealistic expectations. People often imagined empresses as naturally graceful, intelligent, and fearless. But no person is born perfect. An empress was still human. She could feel nervous. She could feel uncertain. She could make mistakes. Yet the world around her demanded perfection. This expectation started from childhood for many royal women. They were trained to control their emotions. They learned how to speak carefully. They learned how to sit, walk, and behave according to strict rules. A simple movement could be judged. A casual comment could become a rumor. They learned that being themselves could sometimes be risky, so they adapted. They created a public version of themselves, a version that the empire could accept. But behind that public image was a private person. A person who might have dreams that had nothing to do with politics. A person who might want a quiet conversation. A person who might want to laugh without thinking about appearances. The palace could make even simple happiness complicated. Friendship was especially difficult. For most people, friendship develops naturally. People meet, they spend time together, they discover common interests. But for an empress, relationships were rarely simple. Every friendship existed inside a political environment. A close companion could gain influence. A trusted person could become important at court. Others might become jealous. Rumors could start. Even choosing a favorite companion could create tension. So the empress had to think carefully about the people closest to her. The palace was full of relationships, but many were shaped by status. Another reason royal life could feel repetitive was the lack of personal exploration. Today, people can discover new places, learn new skills, change careers, and reinvent themselves. Many historical empresses did not have those options. Their identity was fixed. They were born into a role or married into one. Once they became empress, the expectations followed them forever. They could not simply leave and start a different life. The crown was not a temporary position. It became their entire existence. Even old age had its own challenges. A former beauty of the court might find that the world still expected her to remain the same symbol forever. Her appearance changed, her energy changed, but her public role remained. She had to continue representing stability. The palace remembered the image, not always the person. This was one of the cruelest realities of royal life. People admired the empress, but they often admired the idea of her. The real woman could remain unseen. When we look back at history, it is easy to imagine the palace as a place of endless pleasure. But the reality was more complicated. A palace was a place of beauty and pressure, a place of power and restriction, a place where a person could have everything and still feel that something important was missing. The life of an empress teaches us that luxury does not automatically create happiness. A golden room can still feel empty. A crown can still feel heavy. And a person surrounded by thousands can still feel alone. The greatest secret of the empress's life was not how much she owned. It was how much of herself she had to sacrifice. The longer an empress lived inside the palace system, the more she understood one important truth. The palace was not built only to provide comfort. It was built to protect an image. Every wall, every ceremony, every tradition existed for a reason. The empire needed the royal family to appear stable, and the empress was one of the most important symbols of that stability. This meant her personal life was always connected to something bigger than herself. A simple decision could become a political message. A personal preference could become a cultural influence. A small mistake could become a national discussion. For an ordinary person, A mistake might disappear after a few days. For an empress, it could become part of history. This constant awareness changed the way she lived. She learned to be careful. She learned to control her words. She learned to think about consequences before acting. But this careful life also removed the excitement of being spontaneous. A surprise decision, an unexpected adventure, a moment of complete freedom. These were rare. The palace valued control more than excitement, and this created a strange kind of emptiness. The empress had everything around her, but very little that truly surprised her. The royal schedule was often filled with duties, meetings, religious ceremonies, official appearances, lessons, correspondence, visits. The same responsibilities repeated year after year. The outside world changed, new inventions appeared, new ideas spread, new generations grew up. But inside the palace, tradition moved slowly. The empress lived in a world where the past was always present. She was surrounded by objects and customs that belonged to previous centuries. This could create a feeling of being separated from the modern world of her own time. Another reason royal life could feel boring was because many conversations were not normal conversations. People at court rarely spoke freely. Every discussion had a purpose. A compliment might hide a request. A question might hide curiosity. A friendly conversation might be a way to collect information. The empress had to understand what people really meant. This made social life exhausting. Imagine never knowing whether someone liked you for who you were or for what you represented. That uncertainty followed many royal women. The palace also created a strange relationship with beauty. An empress's appearance was constantly discussed. Her clothing, her jewelry, her hairstyle, her age, her health, her overall appearance. The public often judged her based on how well she maintained the image of royalty. This pressure was especially difficult because time affects everyone. No person stays young forever. But the world often expected an empress to remain a perfect symbol. She was expected to represent timeless elegance. Behind the beautiful portraits was a real person experiencing ordinary human changes. Yet those changes were judged more harshly because she was royal. Another hidden challenge was the lack of ordinary achievement. Most people build identity through different experiences. A career, a craft, a personal goal, a journey. But an empress's achievements were often connected to her role. Her success was measured by the empire. Did she support the ruler? Did she produce an heir? Did she represent the dynasty well? Did she maintain tradition? Her personal dreams could become invisible. Many royal women had talents and interests that history barely remembers because their title became the most important thing about them. Some empresses were intelligent writers. Some were skilled artists. Some were great organizers. Some were thoughtful leaders. But history often reduced them to one word: empress. A title that was powerful, but also limiting. There was also the challenge of security. People imagined palace life as completely safe. But power always creates enemies. A royal family could face threats from rivals, political opponents, or even people inside the court. An empress had to live with the knowledge that her position made her a target. This created another invisible burden. The palace protected her, but it also reminded her that danger existed. Guards around her were not only a sign of importance, they were also a sign that freedom was impossible. She could not move through the world unnoticed. She could not disappear into a crowd. She was always the empress, the person, the symbol, the responsibility. The more we examine royal life, the clearer it becomes that boredom was only one part of the story. There was also pressure, isolation, expectation, and the struggle to maintain a sense of self. The life of an empress looked extraordinary because it was different from everyone else's. But different did not always mean easier. Sometimes the most luxurious life could also be one of the most restrictive. The palace was filled with gold, but gold could not answer the simplest human need, the desire to live freely. The story of an empress is often remembered as a story of power. But power has a strange price. The more visible a person becomes, the less private their life becomes. An empress was never just a woman living in a palace. She was a public figure, a political symbol, a representation of the empire itself. This meant that even her personal choices could become matters of public interest. A favorite book, a preferred style of clothing, a friendship, a disagreement. Everything could be noticed. Everything could be interpreted. This constant attention changed the way an empress experienced everyday life. She could not simply enjoy something without thinking about how others might react. Even simple pleasures became complicated. Reading a book was not just reading. People might ask why she chose that book. Supporting an artist was not just supporting art. It could create political influence. Choosing a person to spend time with was not just friendship. It could affect court relationships. Her entire life existed under a microscope. And that is one of the reasons the palace could become emotionally tiring. Another hidden difficulty was that an empress often had to deal with expectations from different directions. The ruler expected loyalty, the court expected elegance. The empire expected stability, the royal family expected tradition, the people expected greatness. Everyone wanted something from her, but very few people asked what she wanted. This created a lonely position. She was surrounded by demands, but rarely surrounded by people who understood her personal struggles. The palace could be full of voices, yet her own voice could become quiet. Many empresses also lived with the pressure of comparison. Previous empresses became examples. Their actions were remembered. Their successes became standards. A new empress was often compared to the women who came before her. Was she as beautiful? Was she as wise? Was she as respected? Was she as successful? This created a never-ending competition with the past. She was not only trying to live her own life, she was trying to match a historical image. The pressure of legacy was enormous, because an empress was not only thinking about the present, she was thinking about how future generations would remember her. Every decision could become part of history. This made even ordinary choices feel important. A person outside the palace might change their mind. An empress had to consider whether changing her mind would appear weak. A normal person could admit a mistake. An empress had to think about whether admitting a mistake would damage authority. The role demanded confidence even during uncertainty. This created emotional distance between the empress and the people around her. The palace environment also affected the way people aged. A normal person's life changes naturally. New experiences create new memories. New places create new perspectives. But many empresses experience fewer changes. Their world remained familiar for decades. The same rooms, the same traditions, the same social circles, the same responsibilities. This repetition could make time feel strangely slow. Years could pass, but life could still feel like the same day repeated. This was the quiet side of royal existence. Not dramatic, not exciting, just endless routine. Yet despite all these limitations, some empresses found ways to create meaning. They used their position to support culture. They encouraged education. They helped shape architecture. They protected traditions. They influenced the arts. They found purpose in the role they were given. Their lives were not only about boredom, they were also about adaptation. An empress had to learn how to survive inside a system that was much larger than herself. She had to find small spaces of freedom. A private conversation, a personal interest, a moment in the garden. a quiet hour with a book. These small moments became valuable because they were rare. When a person has everything, the smallest freedoms can become the most meaningful. That is perhaps the biggest lesson from the life of an empress. The things we often ignore, privacy, choice, normal conversations, personal decisions, can be more valuable than wealth. The crown could give her status. The palace could give her comfort. But neither could guarantee happiness. Because happiness does not come only from having more. Sometimes it comes from having control over your own life. And for many empresses, that was the one thing they had the least. The greatest irony of being an empress was that the entire world could know her name, while almost nobody truly knew her. People saw the official portraits, they saw the magnificent clothing, they saw the royal ceremonies, they saw the powerful image. But behind that image was a person with fears, hopes, frustrations, and dreams. The palace was a place where appearances mattered greatly. The image of perfection was carefully maintained, but perfection was impossible. Every empress had moments of doubt, moments of loneliness, moments when she questioned whether the life she lived was truly her own. The position of empress was not something a person could simply turn off. A queen or empress could not leave the role behind after a difficult day. The title followed her everywhere. Even in private spaces, she was still part of the empire. This made ordinary relaxation almost impossible. For many people, home is where they can stop pretending. But for an empress, even the palace home could feel like a workplace. Every room had history. Every hallway had memories. Every visitor had expectations. The palace was beautiful, but it was also a constant reminder of responsibility. Another reason the life of an empress could feel boring was because her world was carefully limited. She might have access to thousands of books, the finest artists, and the most beautiful gardens. But she could not experience everything. The outside world was full of ordinary moments that royal life often lacked. Walking through a busy street, having an unexpected conversation, discovering a new place without planning, meeting someone who did not care about status. These simple experiences could be impossible. An empress lived above society, but that also meant she was separated from it. The palace created distance, and distance created loneliness. The servants around her also created a unique problem. Having many servants sounds like the ultimate comfort, but when everything is done for you, you can lose connection with ordinary life. A servant prepares your clothes, someone prepares your meals, someone organizes your schedule, someone manages your environment. Over time, an empress could become disconnected from basic experiences. The simple satisfaction of doing something herself became rare. Even small tasks could become impossible because tradition did not allow them. The royal world was built around hierarchy. Everyone had a place, everyone had a role. The empress stood at the top, but being at the top could be isolating. There was nowhere higher to go, no one to look up to, no one who could fully understand the unique pressure she carried. This was especially true during moments of crisis. When the empire faced problems, the empress had to appear strong. She could not openly panic. She could not show uncertainty. The people expected confidence. The court expected control. But inside, she might have been struggling just like everyone else. The difference was that she had to hide it. This emotional burden was one of the hardest parts of royal life. The palace also created a strange relationship with reputation. An empress's reputation could take decades to build, and only moments to damage. A rumor could spread quickly. An enemy could manipulate information. A misunderstanding could become a scandal. Because of this, many empresses became extremely careful. They watched their words, they watched their actions, they watched the people around them. Living this way required constant awareness, and constant awareness is exhausting. The life of an empress was often described as a dream, but dreams are not always what they appear to be. A palace can be beautiful and still feel empty. A crown can be valuable and still feel heavy. A position can be powerful and still feel restrictive. The real story of an empress is not simply about luxury, it is about sacrifice. Sacrifice of privacy, sacrifice of freedom, sacrifice of a normal life. The title gave her importance, but it also demanded almost everything in return. And perhaps the most surprising truth is this. Many empresses did not struggle because they had too little. They struggled because they had so much expected of them. Their lives were not boring because nothing happened. Their lives were boring because everything was controlled. Every moment had a purpose. Every action had a meaning. Every day belonged partly to the empire. And behind the throne, behind the jewels, and behind the palace walls was a human being who simply wanted to live. When people imagine the life of an empress, they often picture endless luxury. They imagine golden rooms, expensive jewelry, grand celebrations, and a life without problems. But the reality was much more complicated. An empress did not simply live in a palace. She lived inside a system built on rules, traditions, expectations, and power. And the most difficult part of that system was that it rarely allowed her to forget who she was. She was always the empress. Even during personal moments, the title remained. This created a strange separation between the person and the position. The woman might want one thing, the empire might need another, and many times the needs of the empire won. One of the clearest examples was the way royal women were expected to behave. An empress had to represent patience. She had to represent wisdom. She had to represent stability. She was expected to be an example for everyone. But being an example is difficult because it means people judge you constantly. Every action could be analyzed. Every choice could be criticized. A smile could be interpreted. A serious expression could create rumors. A conversation could become political. The empress could never fully disappear into the crowd. She was always visible, and being constantly visible can become exhausting. Another hidden challenge was the lack of genuine surprises. For most people, life contains unexpected moments. You meet someone new, you discover a new place, you experience something completely different. But the royal world was designed to reduce uncertainty. Security came first. Protocol came first. Tradition came first. The same things that protected the empress also limited her experiences. The palace was safe, but safety sometimes came with a price. Freedom. An empress might have wanted to explore. She might have wanted to experience the world beyond the palace. But every journey required planning. Every movement required protection. Every appearance had consequences. Even leaving the palace could become a major event. This made adventure rare. Her world became smaller, even though her influence was enormous. This was one of the strangest contradictions in history. A woman could have influence over an entire empire while having a very limited personal world. The palace also changed the meaning of friendship. A normal friendship is usually built on equality. Two people share experiences. They support each other. They speak honestly. But inside a royal court, equality was almost impossible. People treated the empress differently because of her status. Some were respectful, some were afraid, some wanted benefits. This made it difficult to know who truly cared. A person could be surrounded by hundreds and still feel alone. That loneliness is something many historical royal figures experienced. The palace was full of people, but emotional closeness was rare. Another difficult part of being an empress was the pressure of comparison with other royal women. Courts often compared them. Who was more beautiful? Who was more graceful? Who had more influence? Who had the stronger personality? This competition was not always open. Sometimes it existed through rumors and whispers. A single comment could create tension. The Empress had to survive not only political challenges, but also social ones. Her position made her powerful, but it also made her a target. And then there was the question of legacy. Every empress knew that history would judge her. Future generations would look back at her choices. They would ask whether she was successful, whether she was kind, whether she was strong, whether she helped or harmed the empire. This awareness shaped her behavior. She was not only living for the present, she was living for the memory she would leave behind. That could be inspiring, but it could also be a heavy burden. Imagine knowing that every important moment of your life might be recorded, that your mistakes might survive for centuries, that your private struggles might one day become public stories. This was the reality of royal life. The crown was not only a symbol of power, it was also a symbol of permanent judgment. Still, some empresses found ways to create meaningful lives. They supported artists, they encouraged education, they protected traditions, they influenced important decisions, used the limited freedom they had. They discovered that even inside strict systems, a person can still leave a mark. Their stories remind us that the life of an empress was not simply a story of boredom. It was a story of complexity, a story of power and weakness, a story of luxury and loneliness, a story of a human being living under extraordinary expectations. Because the biggest secret of the palace was this: the throne looked like the highest place in the world. But sometimes the higher you stand, the more alone you become. The life of an empress was a life of contradictions. She could be admired by millions, but understood by very few. She could have unlimited resources, but limited choices. She could have great influence, but little personal freedom. This contrast is what makes the history of empresses so fascinating, because behind the powerful image was often a quiet struggle. One of the most overlooked parts of royal life was the emotional pressure. People often think power removes problems, but power can create different problems. An empress did not worry about ordinary survival. She did not worry about finding food or shelter, but she worried about reputation. She worried about the future of the dynasty. She worried about political conflicts. She worried about the people around her. Her problems were different, but they were still real. The palace environment encouraged caution. An empress had to understand that not everyone around her was honest. Some people wanted influence, some wanted wealth, some wanted protection, some wanted access to power. This meant she had to be careful about trust. The people closest to her could sometimes be the most complicated relationships. A servant could become an important source of information. A relative could become a political rival. A friend could become a problem. The palace was not just a home, it was a world of strategy. Every relationship had another layer. This made simple human connection difficult. Another reason the life of an empress could become boring was because she often had limited control over her own image. Today, people can decide how they present themselves. They can change their style. They can change careers. They can reinvent themselves. But an empress was tied to tradition. Her image belonged partly to the empire. She could not simply become a different person. The public expected consistency. They expected a certain type of behavior. The woman behind the crown had to follow the expectations created by the crown. This created a lifelong performance, and performing every day can be exhausting. The palace also created a strange relationship with wealth. An empress could own priceless objects, rare fabrics, beautiful jewelry, magnificent furniture. But these things did not always create happiness. Possessions can provide comfort. They cannot replace freedom. A person can have the most beautiful surroundings and still feel trapped. This is why some royal diaries and historical records reveal a different side of palace life. The beautiful rooms were not always filled with joy. Sometimes they were filled with silence, long hours, private thoughts, waiting. The Empress's schedule was often full, but her personal experiences could be limited. She attended events, she met important people, she performed duties. But how much of that was truly for herself? That was the difficult question. Another challenge was the expectation of emotional control. An empress had to remain calm during political problems. She had to appear confident during uncertain times. She had to support the ruler even when situations were difficult. Her personal feelings often had to come second. This was especially challenging when she faced personal disappointment. A normal person could express sadness openly. An empress often could not. Her emotions were connected to public perception. A moment of weakness could be interpreted as a weakness in the empire itself. So many royal women learned to hide their struggles. They smiled when they were tired. They remained calm when they were worried. They showed strength when they needed comfort. This was one of the invisible sacrifices of the crown. The palace also changed the meaning of time. A young woman entering royal life might imagine excitement. She might imagine endless opportunities. But years later, she might discover that the same routines continued, the same ceremonies, the same responsibilities, the same expectations. The palace that once seemed magical could start feeling repetitive. This is why some empresses searched for personal interests. They collected books. They supported art. They studied history. They created private spaces. These activities gave them something that belonged to them, something beyond the role. Because without personal identity, the title of empress could consume the entire person. The most important lesson from the history of empresses is that privilege and freedom are not the same thing. A person can have power and still feel limited. A person can have luxury and still feel empty. A person can have everything and still want something simple. A normal conversation, a private moment, a choice. The life of an empress was not boring because she lived in a palace. It was boring because the palace often decided how she had to live. The walls were beautiful. The rooms were grand. The crown was magnificent. But the greatest treasure she often lacked was the ability to simply be herself. The story of an empress is not only a story of palaces and power. It is also a story of time, a lifetime spent following rules, a lifetime spent protecting an image, a lifetime spent carrying a responsibility that was much bigger than one person. When a woman became an empress, she did not just receive a title. She received a role that could completely transform her existence. Before the crown, she might have been a daughter, a sister, a friend, or simply a person with personal dreams. After the crown, she became something else. A symbol, a representative, a figure that millions looked toward. The transformation was not always easy. Many empresses had to leave behind the life they understood. They entered a world where everything was different. The language of the court, the traditions, the expectations, the people around them. Even their own identity could change. The palace did not only change where they lived, it changed who they were allowed to be. This is one of the reasons royal life could feel emotionally heavy. An empress was expected to adapt quickly. She had to learn the rules of the court. She had to understand political relationships. She had to behave according to traditions. There was little room for mistakes. A person entering a normal new environment might slowly adjust. A new job, a new city, a new social group. But an empress often had to adjust immediately because everyone was watching. Her learning process was public. Her mistakes were noticed. Her progress was judged. This pressure could make even simple experiences stressful. Another hidden reality was that an empress often lived with a strange form of separation. She was close to the most powerful people in the empire, but she was also separate from ordinary life. She might hear about the struggles of common people. She might receive reports about problems. She might make decisions affecting millions. But she did not always experience those realities directly. The palace created a barrier, a beautiful barrier, a comfortable barrier, but still a barrier. This separation could make the royal world feel like its own universe. Inside that universe, the rules were different. Time was different. Relationships were different. Even emotions were handled differently. The palace trained people to hide, not because they had no feelings, but because showing feelings could be dangerous. An angry expression could create rumors. A moment of sadness could create concern. A personal disagreement could become political. So the empress learned control. She learned patience. She learned silence. But too much control can also become a burden. A person needs moments where they do not have to perform, where they do not have to represent anything, where they can simply exist. For many empresses, those moments were rare. The palace also created a strange relationship with entertainment. People imagine royal life as endless celebrations, but many royal events were not designed for fun. They were designed for appearance. A banquet was a message. A ceremony was a message. A public appearance was a message. The empress was constantly communicating, even when she was not speaking. Her presence itself had meaning. This meant she was always working. Even when she looked relaxed, she was performing a duty. That is another reason the life of an empress could become boring. There was little separation between work and personal life. The role followed her everywhere. Another challenge was the weight of history. An empress knew she would be remembered. That could inspire greatness, but it could also create fear. Would history judge her kindly? Would people misunderstand her? Would her struggles be forgotten? Would her achievements be recognized? These questions mattered because royal figures were not only living in their own time, they were living with the awareness of future judgment. Their lives became stories before they were even finished. And perhaps the saddest part is that many empresses were remembered more for their position than their personality. People remembered the crown, the palace, the dynasty, but not always the individual. The woman who laughed, the woman who worried, the woman who had personal hopes, the woman who wanted a normal life. History often preserved the symbol and lost the person. Yet despite all these limitations, many empresses found ways to create meaning. They supported culture. They protected knowledge. They influenced society. They helped shape the world around them. They proved that even inside a restricted life, a person can still create something valuable. Their stories remind us that power is complicated. It can open doors. It can also close others. The crown can raise someone above everyone else, but it can also separate them from everyone else. And that is the hidden truth behind the question, why was the life of an empress so boring? Because behind all the gold and greatness was a life where freedom was often the rarest luxury. The final truth about an empress's life is that the greatest luxury she often wanted was not gold, jewels, or a bigger palace. It was a simple choice. The ability to decide something for herself. The ability to wake up and choose how to spend the day. The ability to meet someone without worrying about politics. The ability to speak without calculating every word. These ordinary freedoms were priceless because they were the things she had the least. A palace could provide comfort, but it could not always provide independence. This is why the life of an empress was so different from what people imagined. From outside, everything looked perfect. inside everything was controlled. The world saw the crown, the empress felt the weight. The world saw the celebration, the empress experienced the responsibility. The world saw the luxury, the empress understood the limitations. This contrast made royal life one of the most fascinating stories in history. An empress was expected to be many things at once: a leader, a wife, a mother, a diplomat, a symbol, a protector of tradition. But the hardest role was being herself, because every other role had rules. Being herself required freedom, and freedom was exactly what palace life often restricted. The palace was designed around order. Everyone had a place. Everyone had duties. Everyone followed traditions. This created stability. But stability could also become a routine that never changed. The same halls, the same ceremonies, the same expectations. Years could pass while the rhythm of life remained almost identical. For some empresses, the palace became less like a home and more like a stage. Every day was another performance. Every appearance was another responsibility. Every interaction was another moment where she had to represent something larger than herself. This constant performance was one of the hidden costs of royalty. A normal person can have different versions of themselves. They can be serious at work and relaxed at home. They can make mistakes with friends. They can change their mind. They can grow privately. But an empress grew in public. Her changes were noticed. Her choices were analyzed. Her personality became part of history. This made personal growth difficult. The person and the symbol became connected. Another surprising reality was that many empresses had to deal with boredom even when surrounded by activity. The palace was not empty. There were always people. There were always events. There were always responsibilities. But activity does not always create excitement. Sometimes a busy life can still feel repetitive. The same duties repeated. The same conversations repeated. The same expectations repeated. A person can be surrounded by movement and still feel stuck. This was the hidden emotional experience of many royal women. They lived in a world where everything was grand, but not everything was meaningful. The most meaningful moments were often the smallest. A quiet conversation, a private interest, a peaceful walk, a moment away from the public eye. Those small experiences became valuable because they were rare. The story of an empress teaches an important lesson. Having more does not always mean living more. A person can have wealth but lack freedom. A person can have influence but lack privacy. A person can have admiration but lack genuine connection. The crown solved some problems, but it created others. That is why the life of an empress was never as simple as luxury. It was a life of contradictions, a life of beauty and pressure, a life of privilege and sacrifice. A life where the greatest challenge was not ruling others. It was finding a way to remain human while carrying a title that demanded perfection. The empress was not only the woman on the throne, she was also the person behind it. The person who experienced loneliness, the person who wanted trust, the person who sometimes wished for a normal day. And perhaps that is the most surprising truth of all. The woman who had almost everything was sometimes searching for the one thing she could rarely have, a life that truly belonged to her. When we look back at the lives of empresses throughout history, it is easy to focus on the impressive parts. The enormous palaces, the royal ceremonies, the expensive clothing, the powerful titles, the influence over nations. But behind every crown was a human story. A story of someone who had to live under expectations that few ordinary people could imagine. The life of an empress was not boring because she had nothing to do. It was boring because so much of what she did was decided for her. Her schedule, her responsibilities, her public image, her relationships, even parts of her future. The palace gave her a world of comfort, but it also created a world of limitations. She could command attention, but she could not always choose her own path. She could influence history, but she could not always control her own daily life. This was the great contradiction of being an empress. The highest position could still feel like a restricted one. The most beautiful palace could still feel lonely. The heaviest crown was not always made of gold. Sometimes it was made of expectations. The expectation to always be calm. The expectation to always look perfect. The expectation to always put duty before personal happiness. For many empresses, life became a balance between what they wanted and what the empire demanded. Some found ways to use their position for good. They supported education. They encouraged art. They protected traditions. They influenced society. They became more than symbols. They became important figures in history. But even those who achieve greatness face the same reality. Power does not remove the need for freedom. A person can be surrounded by luxury and still miss simple things. A quiet conversation, a genuine friendship, a private moment, a choice made only because they wanted it. These simple freedoms often meant more than the treasures inside the palace. The story of an empress reminds us that appearances can be misleading. A life that looks perfect from outside may have hidden struggles. A person who seems to have everything may still carry invisible burdens. The palace walls protected the empress, but they also separated her. The crown elevated her, but it also isolated her. The title gave her importance, but it also took away pieces of ordinary life. Perhaps the most fascinating part of royal history is not the power of these women. It is their humanity. They were not only rulers, symbols, or historical figures. They were people. People who felt happiness and sadness. People who experienced hope and fear. People who wanted to be understood. And that is why the life of an empress was far more complicated than the beautiful images suggest. The next time we see a portrait of a woman wearing a crown, it is worth remembering something. Behind the jewels was a person, behind the throne was a life, and behind the luxury was a story that was not always glamorous. The life of an empress was not simply a dream, it was a responsibility. A performance, a sacrifice, a world of endless expectations, and sometimes the greatest privilege she could imagine was not having a bigger palace, but having the freedom to simply be herself. The story of an empress does not end when the ceremony ends or when the crown is placed on her head. In many ways, that is when the real struggle begins. A crown is not just an object, it is a promise. A promise to represent something bigger than yourself. A promise to carry traditions. A promise to remain strong even when life becomes difficult. And for many empresses, that promise shaped every single day of their existence. The outside world often imagined the palace as a place where every problem disappeared. But the palace did not remove human emotions. It only changed the kind of problems a person faced. An ordinary person might struggle with survival. An empress struggled with expectations. An ordinary person might fear failure in private. An empress feared failure in front of an entire empire. An ordinary person could disappear after making a mistake. An empress could have her mistakes remembered for centuries. That was the invisible pressure of royalty. Every generation looked back at previous empresses and created legends around them. Some were remembered as brilliant, some as cruel, some as mysterious, some as weak. But behind every historical description was a real person who lived through complicated circumstances. History often simplifies people. It turns them into characters. But real life is always more complicated. An empress could be powerful and vulnerable at the same time. She could be respected and lonely. She could be wealthy and still feel trapped. These contradictions were part of the reality. Another hidden challenge was that an empress often had to sacrifice personal identity for public identity. Before becoming royal, she might have had personal dreams, things she wanted to learn, places she wanted to visit, a life she imagined. But once she became connected to the throne, those dreams often had to change. The empire had a plan for her. The dynasty had expectations. The court had traditions. Her personal wishes became secondary. This could create a quiet sadness. Not the dramatic sadness people write stories about. A quieter kind. The feeling of wondering what life could have been. The feeling of knowing that another path was impossible. This is why some royal women search for meaning in small things. A letter from someone they trusted, a favorite book, a moment in a garden, a piece of music, a private conversation. Small moments became valuable because they belonged only to them. They were not performances. They were real. And perhaps that is what makes the lives of empresses so interesting. Their biggest struggles were not always battles or political conflicts. Sometimes their greatest struggle was simply finding a piece of themselves inside a world that belonged to everyone else. The palace was filled with luxury. But luxury without freedom could become another form of limitation. The throne was powerful, but power without choice could become another kind of burden. The title of Empress was one of the greatest achievements a woman could reach in many historical societies. Yet reaching that position often meant accepting a life that few people would truly understand. A life where every movement had meaning, every word had consequences, every day belonged partly to history. So was the life of an empress really boring? The answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. It was not boring because it lacked excitement. It was not boring because it lacked beauty. It was boring because much of that beauty was controlled. It was a life where everything was planned, everything was organized, everything had a purpose. And sometimes the most exciting thing a person can have is the freedom to choose something meaningless. A random walk, a simple conversation, a normal day. A moment without responsibility. The empress had the world watching her, but sometimes all she wanted was a moment where nobody was watching. That is the hidden reality behind the crown. The palace was magnificent. The throne was powerful. The title was unforgettable. But the woman behind it was still searching for the same thing every human being searches for. A life that feels truly her own. Although the story of an empress often appears to be a story of greatness, the reality was also a story about sacrifice. The crown created a distance between her and the rest of the world. People looked at her differently. They spoke to her differently. They treated her differently. And slowly that difference could change the way she saw herself. Before becoming an empress, she might have been someone with ordinary emotions and ordinary dreams. She might have enjoyed simple conversations. She might have laughed without thinking about appearances. She might have made decisions without considering how others would judge her. But after entering the royal world, every part of her life became connected to responsibility. The palace was not only a residence, it was a system that shaped every moment. A young royal woman learned quickly that her personal desires could not always come first. The empire had needs, the dynasty had needs, the court had needs, and the empress was expected to place all of those above herself. This was one of the hidden reasons royal life could feel empty. A person needs a sense of ownership over their own life, but an empress often had to share ownership with the institution she represented. Her face belonged to the empire. Her actions represented tradition. Her choices created consequences beyond herself. The role was bigger than the individual. This could create a strange feeling of being important and invisible at the same time. Everyone knew the Empress, but few people knew the woman. The palace also changed the meaning of success. For ordinary people, success might mean achieving personal goals, building something, learning something, creating a life they choose. For an empress, success was often measured differently. Was the dynasty stable? Was the court satisfied? Was the empire respected? Was tradition preserved? Her achievements were often judged by how well she served the role, not by how happy she was. This difference reveals something important about royal history. Power and happiness are not the same thing. A person can stand at the highest level of society and still experience personal struggles. The palace had another effect. It slowed down change. The outside world continued moving. New ideas appeared. New cultures developed. New technologies changed life. But royal traditions often moved carefully. The empress lived between the past and the future. She protected old customs while facing a changing world. This could be difficult because adapting too quickly could seem disrespectful. Refusing to change could seem outdated. She had to balance both. That balance required patience, and patience was one of the greatest skills expected from a royal woman. She had to wait for decisions, wait for events, wait for approval, wait for the right moment. A surprising amount of royal life was simply waiting. Waiting for a ceremony, waiting for news, waiting for political situations to change, waiting for the next responsibility. From outside, the palace looked full of activity. Inside, many moments were quiet, sometimes extremely quiet, and that quietness could become its own kind of challenge. The most fascinating part of an empress's story is that she was surrounded by everything humans usually desire: wealth, respect, status, comfort. Yet the things she wanted most were often the simplest: trust, honesty, freedom, a real connection, a moment without a role to play. The crown could give her everything except a guarantee of peace. And perhaps that is why the lives of empresses continue to interest people today, because their stories are not only about royalty, they are about human nature. They show that no position completely removes struggle. No amount of luxury completely removes loneliness. No title completely replaces personal freedom. The woman behind the crown was still searching for the same thing people have always searched for: a meaningful life. The image of an empress has survived for centuries because it represents something powerful. A person standing at the center of history. A person surrounded by wealth and influence. A person whose decisions could affect generations. But when we look beyond the image, we find a much more complicated reality. The life of an empress was not simply a life of luxury. It was a life of constant responsibility. Every day carried expectations. Every action carried meaning. Every mistake carried consequences. She was not allowed to live only for herself. The empire was always present. The throne was always present. The eyes of the world were always present. This is why many empresses experienced a strange kind of isolation. They were surrounded by people but separated by status. They were admired but not always understood. They were respected but not always known. The higher they stood, the harder it became for others to see them as ordinary human beings. The palace created a world where everything looked perfect, but perfection itself became a burden. An empress had to appear calm when she was worried. She had to appear confident when she was uncertain. She had to appear happy when she was exhausted. The image mattered as much as the person, and maintaining that image required enormous effort. The most difficult prison was not made of stone. It was made of expectations. Expectations from the court, expectations from the family, expectations from society. Expectations from history itself. A person can escape a physical place, but escaping expectations is much harder. Still, the story of an empress was not only a story of sadness. Many royal women found ways to create influence. They supported knowledge. They encouraged creativity. They shaped culture. They helped their societies in ways that lasted beyond their own lifetimes. They discovered that even inside a restricted world, they could still leave a mark. That may be the greatest lesson from their lives. A person's circumstances may be limited, but their ability to create meaning can still exist. An empress could not always choose the world she lived in, but she could sometimes choose what she did within that world. She could choose kindness. She could choose wisdom. She could choose how she would be remembered. And that is why history continues to study these women. Not because they wore crowns, not because they lived in palaces, but because they experienced one of the greatest contradictions of human existence. Having everything does not always mean feeling free. The palace walls may have been covered in gold. The throne may have been the most powerful seat in the empire. The jewels may have been priceless, but none of those things could replace the simple human desire for a life that feels personal. A life where choices are truly your own. A life where you can laugh without thinking about appearances. A life where you can speak without fear. A life where you can simply exist. So why was the life of an empress so boring? Because behind the celebrations were endless duties. Behind the luxury were restrictions. Behind the power was pressure. Behind the crown was a person. And perhaps the most surprising truth is this. The woman who appeared to have the entire world at her feet was sometimes searching for the one thing everyone wants. The freedom to live as herself. Even after centuries have passed, the lives of empresses continue to fascinate people. We look at old paintings and see confidence. We read historical records and see power. We hear stories of grand palaces and imagine a perfect world. But history has a habit of hiding the quiet moments. The moments when the palace became silent. The moments when the celebrations ended. The moments when an empress was no longer a symbol and was simply a person alone with her thoughts. Those moments reveal a different side of royal life. A side filled with patience, sacrifice, and the search for personal meaning. The world of an empress was carefully designed. From the outside, that design looked beautiful. Every room had a purpose. Every ceremony had a tradition. Every object had a history. But a perfectly designed world can also become a restricted world. There was little room for randomness, little room for mistakes, little room for an ordinary life. An ordinary life was something many empresses secretly valued, because ordinary moments are often the moments people remember most. A simple conversation, a genuine laugh, a walk without a schedule, a moment where nobody expects anything. For an empress, these simple experiences could become rare treasures. The palace gave her extraordinary things, but it made ordinary things extraordinary. Another hidden reality was the emotional distance created by power. When someone becomes extremely important, people often change how they behave around them. They become more formal, more careful, more respectful. But sometimes respect creates distance. An empress could have hundreds of people around her, yet still miss having someone who treated her normally. Someone who did not care about the crown. Someone who saw the person instead of the position. That kind of connection was difficult to find. The palace was full of conversations, but meaningful conversations were rare. Another challenge was the fear of becoming a disappointment. An empress carried not only her own reputation, but the reputation of the entire dynasty. If she failed, people did not only see it as a personal mistake, they saw it as a failure of the royal image. This pressure shaped everything she did. She had to be careful. She had to be patient. She had to think about the future. The role demanded maturity, sometimes even when she was young. A young woman could enter the palace and immediately be expected to behave like someone who had spent a lifetime preparing. That transformation was not easy. The crown could arrive suddenly, but learning how to carry it took years. And while she learned, the world was watching. This is why many empresses developed incredible self-control. They learned how to handle difficult situations. They learned how to survive political pressure. They learned how to remain calm when everything around them was changing. Their strength was real, but that strength came from necessity. The palace did not allow weakness for long. Still, the question remains, was the life of an empress truly boring? Perhaps the answer depends on how we define boredom. If boredom means having nothing around you, then no. An empress had endless activity. But if boredom means living without surprise, without personal choice, without freedom, then the answer becomes much more complicated. She had everything, but everything was arranged. Everything was planned. Everything had a purpose. And sometimes the most exciting part of life is doing something that has no purpose at all. Something unexpected, something personal, something completely your own. That was the one luxury many empresses could rarely enjoy. Freedom. The story of an empress is therefore not just a story of royalty. It is a story about the human need for independence. Because even the most powerful people in history still wanted the same things: to be understood, to be trusted, to have choices, to live a life that belonged to them. And behind every crown was a person searching for exactly that. The story of an empress is one of the greatest examples of how appearances can hide reality. For centuries, people looked at royal women and saw only the surface. They saw the crown, they saw the palace, they saw the wealth, they saw the power. But they did not always see the person behind those symbols. They did not see the quiet moments. They did not see the pressure. They did not see the sacrifices made to maintain the image of perfection. The life of an empress was never simply about luxury. It was about responsibility. A responsibility that followed her everywhere. The palace was not just a home. It was a place where history was constantly being created. Every meeting mattered. Every decision mattered. Every relationship mattered. The empress lived in a world where even small actions could have large consequences. This made her life extraordinary, but it also made it difficult. The greatest misunderstanding about royalty is the belief that power automatically creates happiness. But history shows something different. Power can bring respect. It can bring influence. It can bring comfort. But it cannot guarantee peace. An empress could control many things around her, but she could not always control her own life. She could influence the empire, but she could not always choose her own path. She could command attention, but she could not command genuine connection. This was the hidden cost of the crown. The role of an empress required constant balance. She had to be strong but graceful, powerful but humble, traditional but adaptable, private but public, human but almost perfect. These impossible expectations created a life unlike any other. The palace demanded that she become an ideal. But behind that ideal was a real woman, a woman who could feel tired, a woman who could feel lonely, a woman who could wonder about another life, a woman who sometimes wanted to escape the endless rules. That does not mean every empress was unhappy. Many found purpose, many found strength, many used their position to create lasting changes. They supported art, they protected knowledge, they influenced culture, they helped shape history. Their lives were not meaningless. They simply carried a different kind of burden, a burden that came with being extraordinary. The truth is that the life of an empress was not boring because she lacked excitement. It was complicated because she lacked freedom. The world around her was full of movement, but her choices were limited. The palace was full of people, but true closeness was difficult. Her days were filled with events, but many of those events were obligations. She had access to everything, but some of the simplest things were the hardest to obtain. A private moment, an honest friendship, a decision made only for herself, a normal day. These became rare treasures. Perhaps the greatest lesson from the history of empresses is that the things we often ignore are sometimes the things that matter most. Freedom, choice, trust, a sense of self. A person does not become fulfilled simply by standing above others. Real happiness comes from feeling connected to your own life. And many empresses spent their lives searching for that connection. The crown was beautiful. The palace was magnificent. The title was powerful. But none of these things could replace the simple human desire to be free. So when we ask, why was the life of an empress so boring? The answer is not that she had nothing. The answer is that she had almost everything except the one thing every person secretly wants, a life that truly belongs to them. Behind the jewels was a woman. Behind the throne was a human being. Behind the empire was a story, and that story was not only about power, it was about sacrifice. It was about loneliness. It was about strength, and above all, it was about the eternal struggle to remain yourself in a world that expects you to become something else.